It is, it's one of the supreme ironies of human history that the substance responsible for so much death and geopolitical upheaval over the last 1,000 years was originally invented by people who were, like, literally trying to cure ailments and live forever.
Yeah, it really is a profound paradox. I mean, we are talking about a chemical mixture that completely rewired the map of the world, right?
Yeah.
But its origins are entirely accidental. It was just a byproduct of a search for a magical elixir of life.
Exactly. And welcome to a brand new deep dive, by the way. Today, we're pulling from a massive repository of historical and chemical data to look at a single world-altering substance, which is gunpowder.
Yes, the big one.
And the mission for you, the listener, today is to look past the obvious, straightforward battlefield applications. We want to really understand the accidental chemistry that makes it work, the bizarre historical supply chain logistics, and the surprisingly weird everyday uses of a powder that reshaped human civilization.
So to start, we really need to define what gunpowder, or black powder, as it's often called, to distinguish it from modern smokeless powders, what it actually is.
Right.
It is the earliest known chemical explosive, but its unique superpower isn't about exploding in the way we usually think of it. It doesn't actually detonate, it deflagrates.
Wait, so it's not actually exploding? Because, when I see a historic cannon fire in a movie, it looks like a massive explosion. It definitely sounds like one.
Oh, sure, it looks and sounds like one, but the physics are completely different. So high explosives like TNT or C4, those detonate. They undergo a supersonic reaction, creating this massive shockwave that violently shatters whatever is around them.
Okay, so a shattering effect.
Right. If you put TNT in a cannon barrel, you wouldn't shoot a cannonball. You would just blow the steel barrel into, like, 1,000,000 pieces of shrapnel. Gunpowder, on the other hand, deflagrates, meaning it burns at subsonic speeds.
So it's really just burning incredibly fast.
Yes, exactly. And when you pack it tightly into a confined space, like behind a heavy iron projectile in a gun barrel, that rapid burning generates a sudden, enormous volume of hot gas.
And that gas has to go somewhere.
Precisely. The pressure builds up instantly and takes the path of least resistance, which means it violently pushes the shot out of the muzzle. It's a propellant. It pushes rather than shatters.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how this perfect propellant was discovered, we have to travel back to 9th century China during the Tang Dynasty.
Right, the early alchemists.
Yeah, you have Taoist alchemists who are essentially the cutting-edge scientists of their day. And they're mixing all sorts of minerals, herbs, and animal parts, trying to find a potion for immortality. And the Chinese name they eventually gave this substance, huyao. It literally translates to fire medicine.
Which is incredibly fitting, considering the earliest written accounts we have of it are essentially medical safety warning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there is a 9th century text called the Zhenyuan Miaodao Yao Lui, and it documents how some early alchemists were heating a mixture of sulfur, realgar, saltpeter, and honey.
Okay. Let's look at those ingredients, because they are wild. Honey, I assume, is just a sticky binder or like a source of carbon. But realgar.
Yeah, so realgar is an arsenic sulfide mineral. It is highly toxic.
Oh, wow.
So these alchemists are literally throwing poison, sugar, and fertilizer into a hot pot. And the text notes the result of this particular experiment rather tragically. It says smoke and flames erupted, the alchemists' hands and faces were burnt, and the entire house where they were working basically burned to the ground.
I mean, that is the ultimate do not try this at home warning, right? Read 1,000 years ago.
Totally.
So what was actually happening in that burning house? Let's talk about the chemistry, because you can't just throw those random materials in a bowl and conquer the world. It's like baking the world's most dangerous cake. If you use pure carbon instead of partially decomposed wood charcoal, it barely lights up like a match head. The baking process has to be exact.
Yes, the reaction requires an incredibly precise chemical trinity. The classic gunpowder recipe eventually stripped away the arsenic and the honey and settled on 3 vital ingredients.
Right.
First, you need saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. This acts as the oxidizer. It fundamentally supplies the oxygen for the chemical reaction, which is why gunpowder doesn't need ambient air to burn. It literally brings its own oxygen to the party.
That makes sense. And second is the fuel, which is charcoal, and the third is sulfur. But earlier you mentioned the sulfur acts almost like a kindling to lower the ignition temperature. How does that actually do that?
Well, this is where the physical chemistry gets pretty brilliant. Sulfur has a very low melting point around 115 degrees Celsius. So when you introduce a spark to gunpowder, the sulfur melts almost instantly into a liquid.
Okay.
And that liquid sulfur coats the other ingredients, creating this combustible medium that allows the fire to spread through the entire mixture in a fraction of a second.
And what about the charcoal? Because I know you can't just scrape pure carbon off a burnt log and expect it to work.
Right, you can't. The charcoal used for gunpowder is partially pyrolyzed cellulose. Basically, the wood is baked without oxygen, but it isn't completely decomposed into pure carbon.
So this still has some structure to it.
Exactly. That specific partial breakdown leaves the microscopic cellular structure of the wood intact. It creates a highly porous material, almost like a microscopic sponge.
Oh, I see.
So when you grind everything together, the saltpeter crystals get lodged deep inside the high surface area pores of that charcoal sponge. The liquid sulfur coats it, the saltpeter provides the oxygen, and the charcoal burns furiously.
And the ideal ratio they eventually settled on was what, about 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur?
That's right. But the reaction isn't clean. When this deflagration happens, it leaves behind a massive physical byproduct. Combustion actually converts less than half the mass of the gunpowder into pushing gas.
Wait, really? Less than half?
Yeah. The rest becomes particulate matter, a tremendous amount of solid waste. It produces a dense, thick smoke, which, famously would blind armies and give away a soldier's position on the battlefield.
Right, the classic smoky battlefield paintings.
But the unseen problem is the soot left inside the gun barrel. That soot contains potassium oxide, which is highly hygroscopic.
Meaning it pulls water straight out of the air.
Yes, it actively absorbs atmospheric moisture, turning into potassium hydroxide. And potassium hydroxide is incredibly caustic. It actively eats away at iron and steel.
Oh, man. So firing a gun meant you were literally lining your barrel with a corrosive paste.
Precisely. Gunpowder was an absolute nightmare to clean and maintain, which is a major reason why militaries were so desperate to replace it with modern smokeless powders in the late 19th century.
But, before modern chemistry could replace it, this fire medicine had to conquer the globe. And the weapons evolved rapidly in China.
They really did.
By the 10th century, they were attaching it to fire arrows. By the 12th century, during the Jinsong Wars, they developed fire lances, which were bamboo tubes filled with powder that shot flames and bits of shrapnel at the enemy.
Sort of an early shotgun.
Yeah, exactly. And then by 1288, we have archaeological evidence of the Heilongjiang hand cannon. And that's a true cast metal gun with a chamber and a touch hole.
Right. The technological evolution inside China is very well documented. Where it gets incredibly murky is tracing exactly how it reached the rest of the world.
The great historical mystery.
Yeah, it spread across Eurasia, and most historians agree the Mongols were the primary vector for this transmission. By the period between 1240 and 1280, the Islamic world had fully integrated it. A Syrian scholar named Hassan al-Rama wrote a military treatise containing like 107 different gunpowder recipes.
And he referred to the main ingredient, saltpeter, as Chinese snow, which leaves a pretty massive breadcrumb trail as to where he got it.
It does. He also described fireworks as Chinese flowers, but Al-Rama's text is famous because it contains an illustration of what is essentially a medieval torpedo.
A medieval torpedo.
Yeah, he called it the egg which moves itself and burns. It was a pear-shaped vessel filled with gunpowder and metal filings, propelled by a large rocket, and it was designed to glide across the surface of the water and slam into enemy ships.
Okay, hold on. You were giving me incredibly specific diagrams for a rocket-propelled torpedo in Syria in the 1200s. But earlier we were talking about guys holding bamboo sticks shooting sparks.
Right.
How do we actually know when a flaming stick officially became a gun? Or when a firecracker became a torpedo? Like, if a chronicler writes about a long lance shooting evil-smelling smoke at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, how do historians actually know if that's a cannon, an early gas attack, or just a really smoky stick?
Isn't tracing this a total guessing game?
It is the absolute bane of military historians. The academic term for it is semantic change, and it creates a total etymological nightmare.
How so? Well, when a totally unprecedented technology appears, people almost never invent a brand new word for it immediately. They repurpose an old word that describes something similar.
Oh, like how we use dialing a phone, even though rotary dials haven't existed for decades.
Precisely. That's a perfect example. In Arabic texts, the word naft originally meant naphtha, which was an older incendiary liquid like Greek fire.
Right.
But later, naft was used to mean gunpowder. So when you read a 13th century battle account that says soldiers threw naft, you have to guess. Are they throwing liquid fire or explosive powder?
That's fascinating.
And the Chinese word pow went through the exact same transition. It originally meant a mechanical stone-throwing catapult. Later, it was repurposed to mean cannon. So translating these ancient texts is just fraught with ambiguity.
The linguistic fog of war. But regardless of what they called it, the spread was undeniable. It reached India, again likely via the Mongols. And centuries later, the Sultanate of Mysore was using advanced bamboo rockets against the British.
Right, the famous Mysorean rockets.
Yeah, the ones from Tipu Sultan, which were essentially bamboo tubes, tightly bound with iron to hold massive pressure.
Which, by the way, directly inspired the rockets the British later used to bombard Fort McHenry in the United States.
And the rocket's red glare. That traces straight back to Indian gunpowder technology.
It absolutely does.
And in Southeast Asia, after a failed Mongol invasion of Java in 1293, the locals captured the technology and scaled it up to a terrifying degree. I mean, by the 16th century, the Javanese were casting bronze sacred cannons that weighed up to 8 tons.
8 tons of bronze.
Right. Just imagine the sheer heat, the massive infrastructure, and the engineering required for a medieval society to cast an 8-ton piece of bronze just to harness the expanding gas of this ancient fire medicine.
It's an incredible feat. But here is the logistical reality, which we have to talk about. Knowing the 75 15-ton recipe and building a giant cannon was really only half the battle. Making the gunpowder reliable enough to mass produce and actually transport to a battlefield required a massive leap in processing technology.
Okay, let's talk about the nightmare of serpentine powder. Because in early Renaissance Europe, gunpowder was mixed dry.
Right.
The ingredients were ground together into a fine, flour-like dust. But think about how armies traveled back then. They are moving in heavy wooden carts pulled by horses over incredibly bumpy, rutted dirt roads for weeks at a time.
And the vibration was the enemy. If dry, dusty gunpowder vibrated in a barrel during transport, the ingredients physically separated based on their density.
Just from shaking.
Yeah, the heavy sulfur sank to the bottom of the barrel, and the light charcoal powder vibrated to the top. The mixture was completely ruined.
So the artillery crews arrive at a siege, open a barrel, and find a layer of useless charcoal on top. What did they actually do?
They had to remix the powder in the field. Right before a battle, gunners would lay out tarps and use wooden shovels to blend the explosive dust back together.
While cannons are actively firing around them, a stray spark in a cloud of explosive dust would be catastrophic.
It was incredibly hazardous. The solution to this didn't arrive until the late 14th century with a processing upgrade called corning.
Corning?
Yes. Powder makers realized that if they wet the powder during the grinding phase, sometimes using water, or often distilled spirits, it turned into a damp paste.
Oh, okay.
They would then take this paste and force it through a sieve or a screen, forming little uniform clumps or corns. Once these clumps dried, they stayed perfectly bound together. The sulfur couldn't sink.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. So they made it into little solid clumps. But wait, why would making it clumpy make it burn faster and more powerfully? Wouldn't a fine dust catch fire much easier than a dense rock of powder?
Well, think about packing an espresso machine. If you take coffee dust and you tamp it down incredibly hard into a solid, tight brick in the portafilter, what happens to the water when you turn the machine on?
It chokes. The water just sits on top because it can't find a path through the dense dust.
Exactly. Fire acts the exact same way in a dense dust. But if you have coffee ground perfectly, or in this case, gunpowder formed into tiny uniform corns, what do you naturally have sitting between those corns?
Air gaps.
Yes. The physical shape of the clumps creates perfect microscopic air gaps throughout the entire barrel. When you introduce a spark, the hot gas and the flames flash through those air gaps instantly, igniting every single grain of powder at the exact same millisecond.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Corning didn't just solve the transport problem, it increased the explosive power of the gunpowder by 30 to 300%. It completely changed the reaction dynamics.
Okay, so corning perfects the physical shape of the powder, but you still need mountains of raw ingredients. And this brings us to the great barnyard hustle.
Wow, this is fascinating.
Right, because charcoal and sulfur were relatively easy to mine or burn. Saltpeter was the ultimate bottleneck. It doesn't just grow on trees. It naturally forms from decomposing organic matter reacting with alkaline soil.
And France had a particularly severe crisis with this. Unlike Britain, which controlled massive saltpeter imports from India, the French crown had to source it domestically.
Right.
For hundreds of years, they relied on a deeply unpopular group of men called the saltpetermen. These royal agents operated under a warrant called the droit de feu, which translates to the right to dig.
And they weren't digging in pristine mines, were they? They were digging in the poorest places imaginable.
The most nitrous-rich soil is found in places saturated with animal or human waste, so peasants' barnyards, stables, cellars, and dovecotes.
Wow.
These saltpetermen had the legal authority to walk onto your private farm, tear down the walls of your stable, and dig up the dirt underneath your animals to boil it down for saltpeter. And they didn't have to compensate you for the damage.
Imagine a government agent knocking down your garage just to scrape the dirt underneath it to fund a war. The corruption must have been rampant.
Oh, it was. Wealthy landowners would simply bribe the saltpetermen to bypass their estates, which meant the burden of the military supply chain fell entirely on the poorest, most vulnerable farmers in France.
It was a bureaucratic and social nightmare. But that all changed in the 1770s, right? Thanks to Antoine Lavoisier. Today, we revere Lavoisier as the father of modern chemistry. He discovered the role oxygen plays in combustion. But at the time, he was a lawyer and a tax collector, and the king appointed him to head the French Gunpowder administration.
Yes, and he looks at this chaotic, destructive system of tearing up peasants' farms, and he completely overhauls it.
But how did he actually fix the supply problem? Because he couldn't just invent saltpeter out of thin air.
He fundamentally industrialized the biological decay process. Lavoisier abolished the droit de fouille, stopping the barnyard destruction. Instead, he instituted artificial nitraries, or saltpeter beds.
What do those look like?
He instructed workers to build massive, layered beds of rotting organic matter, manure, plant waste, and ashes mixed with limestone. By strictly controlling the moisture, the exposure to air, and the alkaline balance, he created ideal environments for nitrifying bacteria to thrive. He essentially turned saltpeter production into a controlled, scientific agriculture.
He farmed the bacteria, and the results were staggering. He did it so efficiently that France went from having a desperate gunpowder shortage to producing a massive, high-quality surplus in just a few years.
And we know where that surplus went.
Exactly. Who happened to benefit from that French surplus? The American Revolution. The French exported massive amounts of Lavoisier's top-tier powder to the American colonies, playing a decisive role in their victory over the British.
Lavoisier's intervention is a perfect illustration of how the history of gunpowder isn't just a history of generals and tactics. It is a history of logistics, chemistry, and state bureaucracy.
So, Lavoisier solves the military bottleneck. Empires now have tens of thousands of barrels of this highly optimized corn powder. But because it deflagrates, because it pushes rather than violently shatters, people start realizing that this massive military surplus is actually the perfect industrial tool.
Right.
Which brings us to the surprisingly bizarre, non-lethal side of gunpowder. So what does this all mean for you and me?
Well, it's low Bryceland's that pushing quality made it the absolute best tool for mining and quarrying fragile, monumental stone.
Right, like if you are an architect and you want a giant, pristine block of slate for a roof or a massive slab of marble for a statue, you can't use high explosives. Dynamite or TNT would turn a beautiful marble slab into useless gravel.
Exactly.
Gunpowder, if packed correctly into drill holes, just gently nudges the rock face apart, leaving the stone perfectly intact.
It was also used in some incredibly ambitious, though misguided, attempts at engineering. In 1673, the brilliant Dutch physicist Christian Huygens literally tried to build a gunpowder engine.
Wait, really? A gunpowder engine?
Yeah. Before steam power was perfected, he thought he could create a mechanical vacuum inside a cylinder by detonating small charges of gunpowder, and then use that vacuum to drive a piston.
I am assuming a car powered by tiny cannon blasts didn't catch on.
It failed completely. The mechanics of constantly feeding powder into a hot cylinder and dealing with that corrosive soot we talked about earlier made it completely impossible.
That makes sense.
But the sheer versatility of the powder in emergency situations is astonishing. Fast forward to 1809, after the grueling Battle of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon's famous chief surgeon, Dominique Jean Leray, found himself with thousands of wounded, starving soldiers and a severe lack of salt to preserve or flavor their food.
Okay.
He actually used gunpowder to season a horse-meat bouillon.
Wait, why wouldn't an explosive taste good? That sounds incredibly toxic.
Well, it connects right back to the chemistry we discussed at the beginning. The primary ingredient in gunpowder is saltpeter, potassium nitrate. It is literally a salt. It has a slightly bitter, salty taste, and more importantly, nitrates are incredibly effective at curing and preserving meat. It's the exact same chemical reason we use nitrates in hot dogs and cured sausages today. Larry knew his chemistry, and he used his artillery supplies to safely feed his patients.
Okay, seasoning your soup with artillery powder is a whole new level of hardcore. And the weird uses don't even stop there. British sailors out at sea used it for what's called traumatic tattooing.
Traumatic tattoo.
Yeah, if they didn't have access to proper ink, they would prick their skin with needles and vigorously rub fine gunpowder into the wound to create a permanent blue-black mark.
Wow, I had no idea.
And even moving into the modern era, you have artists like the Los Angeles-based Ed Ruscha, who literally used gunpowder as a visual medium, rubbing it into paper to create incredibly textured artwork in the 1960s.
That is amazing. It is a profound reminder that technology is rarely used for just one intended purpose, you know? It permeates every level of society, from warfare to cuisine to art.
So, to recap the journey we've been on today for you, the listener, we started with an accidental Taoist medicine containing arsenic and honey that blew up alchemists' houses. We saw it evolve into a global propellant that sparked endless translation debates over smoky lances and flying eggs.
Right.
We learned how the vibration of a wooden cart could ruin a medieval army's day until they learned to make explosive espresso clumps. We watched a French tax collector save the American Revolution by scientifically rotting manure instead of tearing down peasant barnyards. And we saw how the powder that sank armadas was also used to extract the stone of our monuments and season a surgeon's horse soup.
It is quite the resume. And if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, it raises an important and somewhat provocative question for you to mull over.
Oh, definitely.
Gunpowder changed the world purely by accident as a byproduct of a search for eternal life. It was a complete tangent to the original goal. So look around at the hyper-advanced technology we are developing today, from artificial intelligence algorithms to synthetic biology and gene editing. These are tools we are designing to solve very specific contemporary problems. What current technology might accidentally become the fire medicine that completely rewires human history 1,000 years from now?
It is a staggering thought. The next world-altering substance or code might already be sitting in a lab somewhere, totally misunderstood by the people who created it. Just like those Tang Dynasty alchemists, staring at their burnt hands in a smoldering house, completely unaware that their failed medicine for immortality had just given birth to the most lethal and transformative force in human history. Okay, so picture this. You're walking down the street.
Right.
It's a Tuesday morning, maybe 8 a.m. The sun is just coming up. The streetlights above you. They didn't just turn off on a timer because a clock struck 8.
They sensed the ambient light.
Exactly. They sense the light levels rising and dim themselves incrementally to save these tiny microseconds of energy.
Uh-huh.
And then you finish your coffee and throw the cup into a trash can on the corner.
And that can doesn't just sit there.
No, it sends a ping to a central server saying, hey, I have 80% capacity, route the truck to me.
And the traffic lights at the intersection right next to you, they aren't blinking red and green based on some scheduled program 3 years ago.
Right, they're watching.
They are watching the cars. They are adjusting the green light duration in real time to flesh out a jam before it even forms.
And that is exactly the vibe we are exploring today. Welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we are getting into a concept that, well, when I say smart city, I think most people listening have a very specific image in their heads.
Oh, absolutely. Usually involves a lot of chrome.
That's chrome?
Yeah.
Or science fiction.
The Jetsons.
Jetsons, flying cars, robot maids, glass tubes, shooting people into skyscrapers.
Yeah.
Or, if you're a bit more cynical, maybe something like Blade Runner.
Minority Report.
Yes, Minority Report. A neon-soaked dystopia where the sidewalk scans your retina and judges you for walking too slowly.
That is the pop culture baggage we bring to this term. It's always either a utopian paradise or a complete surveillance nightmare. But the reality is much more beige.
Beige. I like that.
And much more immediate. It is already here. It's buried in the infrastructure right now.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We have a massive stack of source material today. Reports, case studies from Amsterdam to Beijing, technical breakdowns of what actually makes a city, quote-unquote, smart.
And we really need to move past the buzzwords today. We have to figure out why governments and these massive tech corporations are absolutely obsessed with this concept.
We need to look at the machinery under the sidewalk.
Exactly. And most importantly, we have to walk that very thin line between efficient urban paradise and a totalitarian control grid.
Because, as it turns out, the city is watching you. But according to the data, it might actually be trying to save you from yourself.
Or at least save you from sitting in traffic.
Which, let's be honest, feels like saving my life sometimes.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. I tried to find a dictionary definition of smart city to kick this off, and I just hit a wall. Is there actually a single definition?
The short answer is no. There is no single globally accepted definition. It is an incredibly fuzzy concept.
That seems really convenient for the marketing departments of tech companies.
Oh, it is incredibly convenient. The term gets slapped on literally everything. For some people, a smart city is just digitizing public services, like Estonia, for example.
Oh, right, where everything is online.
Yes. You can vote online, file your taxes in 5 minutes. That is considered smart governance. But for others, it's not smart until you have an AI managing the water pressure in every single pipe in the city.
So it ranges from a really good website all the way to Skynet.
Effectively, yes. But if we look closely at the source material, particularly the academic breakdowns, there is a core goal that unifies all these definitions.
Right, the integration part.
Yes. It's not just about using technology for the sake of it. It's about integrating 3 very specific things. ICT, which is information and communication technologies, human capital, and governance.
And they combine these 3 things to solve one very specific, very old economic problem.
The tragedy of the commons.
Okay, so I remember this vaguely from Econ 101, but usually it's about like sheep grazing on a shared field. How does a sheep field apply to downtown Los Angeles or Beijing?
It is the exact same dynamic. Just replace the field with the road network. The commons is the road. It is a shared limited resource. Now imagine you are a driver. You want to get to work on time.
That is my self-interest.
Right. And every other driver on the road has that exact same self-interest.
So we all get in our cars at 8:30 a.m.
And because you all act on that individual self-interest simultaneously, you destroy the resource. You create gridlock. You create pollution. You waste fuel.
So by trying to save time individually, we ensure that everyone loses time collectively.
That is the tragedy.
We ruin the party because we all try to get the best slice of cake at the exact same time.
Perfectly put. Ideally, a smart city uses data to fix this collective selfishness. If the city knows where everyone is, where they are going, and how fast they're moving, it can act as a central nervous system.
It optimizes the flow.
Exactly. It manages the resource so the tragedy doesn't happen.
So the city becomes the ultimate referee.
In a way, yes. It mediates our interactions with the infrastructure to maximize efficiency for everyone.
Okay, so that is the why. Let's get into the how. The actual anatomy of a smart city. I really like the analogy in our notes comparing the city to a biological body.
It's a great framework.
Yeah, if we are building this thing from the ground up, what are the organs?
Well, at the very bottom of the tech stack, you have the sensory organs.
The eyes and ears.
Right. In a human, this is your retina, your eardrum, your nerve endings.
Yeah.
In a city, this is the hardware layer. Cameras, obviously. But also smart meters on your house, air quality sensors on lamp posts, RFID tags on cargo loop detectors embedded in the asphalt to count cars.
I even read about acoustic sensors that can detect the sound of a gunshot and triangulate the exact location instantly.
Yes, shot spotter technology and things like it. These devices are constantly collecting raw data from the physical world. But eyes are useless without optic nerves.
Right, they need to send the signal somewhere.
Exactly. So the second layer is the nerves, the connectivity.
The wired infrastructure and the IoT, the Internet of Things.
This is your fiber optic cables running underground, the 5G towers, the LoRaWAN networks.
LoRaWAN.
Low power, wide area networks. They are designed specifically for sensors to ping tiny bits of data over long distances without draining their batteries.
Got it. So if the sensors are the eyes, the nerves are the pathways that send that signal up to the brain.
Precisely. And that brings us to the brain. This is the intelligence layer.
This is where the magic, or depending on your view, the creepy stuff happens.
This is cloud computing, massive data centers, and artificial intelligence. The nerves dump millions of gigabytes of raw data into the brain. The brain processes it, looks for patterns, and makes decisions.
Like traffic is building up on Main Street, extend the green light on Fifth Avenue by 20 seconds.
Exactly. So it's input from sensors, transmission through nerves, and processing in the brain.
But here is where the source material threw a curveball that I found really fascinating. We tend to think of intelligence in a smart city as just silicon chips, just the AI.
Right. We assume it's all digital.
But the research actually identifies 3 distinct types of intelligence, and the first one has absolutely nothing to do with computers.
You're talking about orchestration intelligence.
Yes, and the example given in the sources was Bletchley Park.
which is such a brilliant historical pull.
I mean, when I think of Bletchley Park, I think of World War II. I think of Alan Turing, cigarette smoke clicking typewriters. I do not think smart city.
But look at the definition of the term. Orchestration intelligence is about distinct institutions and communities collaborating to solve a complex problem. Bletchley Park was arguably the very first smart community.
Because they brought everyone together.
Yes, you had the military, you had mathematicians, you had crossword puzzle solvers, all orchestrated into a human computer to crack the Enigma code.
So a city can be considered smart just because its people and organizations are wired together effectively, even if they're literally using paper and pencil.
Exactly. It is about civic intelligence. Think about it. If you have all the digital sensors in the world, but your police department, your fire department, and your sanitation department refuse to share data, your city is dumb.
Orchestration is the software of human cooperation.
Beautifully stated. It's the foundational layer.
That is a really important distinction. It's not just gadgets. So what is the second type of intelligence?
Empowerment intelligence. This is about the city acting as a platform. Think of places like Kisa Science City in Stockholm or the Cyberport in Hong Kong.
I've heard of Cyberport. It's like a big tech up-ad.
It is, but the intelligence part is that the city deliberately provides the infrastructure. They provide the open data, the high-speed networks, the legal frameworks, so that private innovators can come in and build on top of it.
Oh, it's like a sandbox. The city builds a really good sandbox, and the startups come in and build the castles.
Precisely. The city empowers the citizens and businesses to be smart. And then finally, we have the third type, which is what we usually think of. Instrumentation intelligence.
The heavy tech.
Real-time data collection. The classic example here is Amsterdam.
Okay, what is Amsterdam doing that makes them the poster child for instrumentation?
They have gone all in on the instrumented city model. They have a common IP infrastructure that connects everything. But the example that always sticks out to people is the garbage.
The solar-powered trash cans.
It sounds so mundane, but it is brilliant. Think about a normal city. A garbage truck drives a fixed route every Tuesday. It stops at every single can, whether it's full overflowing or completely empty.
Which is incredibly inefficient. It wastes gas, it creates traffic.
Yeah, noise.
Yeah, the noise of a garbage truck at 6 a.m. is the worst.
In Amsterdam, the cans are smart. They have a solar panel on top to power a small compactor inside. So first, they squash the trash, meaning they can hold up to 5 times as much.
Which is already a huge improvement.
And second, when they are finally full, they send a text message to the sanitation department. The trucks only go to the cans that actually need emptying.
See, that is the kind of utility I love. It's not a flying car, but it solves a real daily annoyance. It's practical.
And that brings us perfectly to the second section of our deep dive. The practical applications. We've built the body, we understand the brain. Now, what does this thing actually do for us on a daily basis?
Let's talk about movement, urban flow.
Yeah.
Because I think nothing makes people hate a city more than a bad commute.
Traffic congestion is actually the #1 driver for smart city adoption globally. It costs billions and billions of dollars in lost productivity every year. So we are seeing the massive rise of smart mobility.
And to see the cutting edge of this, you really have to look at Asia, specifically China.
Yes, the city brain concept.
Right. This was championed by Alibaba. Right.
Yes, it started in Hangzhou, but it has been exported to places like Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia.
How is the city brain different from just a normal traffic control center with cameras?
In a traditional center, you have humans looking at a wall of screens. They react. They say, oh, there's a crash on Highway 4, dispatches a patrol car.
It's reactive.
Right. The city brain is AI-driven and predictive. It ingests data from video cameras, GPS data from public transport mapping apps, ride-sharing cars. It controls the traffic lights across the entire grid simultaneously.
That's basically playing SimCity in real time.
Exactly. And it does things humans can't. It creates a green wave for ambulances.
The green wave.
If an ambulance is moving, the brain calculates its route and turns every light green in front of it and red on all the cross streets automatically. No human intervention needed.
That is incredible for emergency services. Just clearing the path instantly. And I guess the logical next step for flow is removing the human driver entirely.
That is Baidu's Apollo project, autonomous driving. The theory is if you remove the human driver, you remove the erratic behavior. You remove the people braking for no reason looking at their phones.
You remove the tragedy of the common selfishness.
Theoretically, yes. If the cars are talking to each other and the city, they don't even really need to stop at intersections. They just weave through each other perfectly timed.
But even with human drivers, you can control flow with hardware. Did you see the note in the sources about retractable bollards?
I did.
This felt like something straight out of a spy movie to me.
It is surprisingly common in Europe, actually. A bollard is just a sturdy metal post that blocks traffic from entering a pedestrian street. Usually they are fixed in concrete, or maybe you have a padlock on them.
Right, and the delivery guy has to get out of his truck, find the key, unlock it, pull it down, drive over it, put it back up.
In a smart city, the bollard is hydraulic, and it is connected to a camera with ALPR, automatic license plate recognition.
So the delivery truck pulls up.
The camera scans the plate. It checks a central database instantly. Does this specific truck have a permit for this street at this specific time?
And if yes, the bollards just sink into the ground.
Exactly. The truck passes. The bollards rise back up.
Seamless. Highly efficient.
Very efficient.
So here comes the big. But for that system to work smoothly, there has to be a camera recording every single car that drives down that street.
And checking it against a central government database.
Which brings us crashing into the most controversial part of this anatomy, safety versus surveillance.
This is the primary friction point of the entire smart city concept. We see this heavily marketed as the safe city model.
Safe city.
Yes, companies like Huawei and ZTE are massive players here. Their pitch to city governments is very simple and very persuasive. Use our technology to protect your citizens.
And I mean, who is going to say no to safety?
Exactly. It's a very compelling sales pitch. Catch criminals faster, find missing children, prevent accidents.
But the implementation looks a lot like a digital panopticon. The Belgrade case study really stood out to me in the materials.
This was a major flashpoint. In 2018, the Serbian government announced a partnership with Huawei to install 1,000 smart cameras across Belgrade.
1,000 cameras in one city.
And they were not just recording video. These cameras were equipped with advanced facial recognition and license plate recognition software.
So you literally cannot walk down the street without the government knowing exactly who you are, where you are, and who you are walking with.
That is the reality of the technology. The government argued it was strictly for traffic safety and catching violent criminals.
But civil rights groups argued it was the end of anonymity in public spaces.
It's where the convenience versus privacy debate stops being a theoretical academic debate and starts being a real fight.
Because if the infrastructure exists to track a known terrorist, it also exists to track a political protester.
Oh.
Or a journalist. Or an ex-girlfriend.
Precisely. The capability is fundamentally built into the hardware. It's not something you can just turn off easily once it's fully integrated into the police dispatch system.
The sources mentioned visual surveillance was one of the top 3 spending categories for smart cities recently, right?
In 2022, yes. This isn't a side project for these cities. It is a main pillar of the entire smart city industry.
That is definitely chilling. But let's pivot to something slightly less terrifying, but equally critical to making this all work. Energy.
Right, because all these servers, all these cameras and electric cars, they need a lot of juice.
And the power grid we have right now is kind of dumb.
Very dumb. It was built for a world where we burn a pile of coal, produce a steady stream of power, and send it one way down the wire to your house.
Plant to plug, one direction.
Right, but now we want renewable energy. Yeah. We want solar, we want wind. The problem is clouds move, the wind stops blowing, the power supply becomes highly variable.
So the grid naturally creates gaps in supply.
A smart grid uses data to balance that load dynamically. It talks to the devices in your home. It might tell your smart washing machine, hey, demand on the grid is really high right now. Wait 15 minutes to run the spin cycle.
Wow. And the concept of positive energy districts, that sounds really optimistic.
It's basically the holy grail of urban planning right now. Mm-hmm. Imagine a neighborhood where every single roof has solar panels. The buildings are super insulated, and they have massive local battery storage.
Okay.
The goal is for that district to produce more energy than it consumes over the course of a year.
So instead of sucking power from the city grid, it's actually feeding power back into it.
Exactly. The neighborhood itself becomes a decentralized power plant. But to do that safely, you need immense amounts of data and automated control systems to manage the flow of electricity in 2 directions simultaneously.
So we have the nerves, the brain, the senses. Mm-hmm. We have traffic that flows perfectly trashed, that calls for its own pickup, mm-hmm. and neighborhoods that act like giant batteries. On paper, this all sounds like a paradise of efficiency, but cities aren't made of paper. They are made of people. And this is where our deep dive gets a bit messy. We have to talk about the human element.
This is the crucial missing link in so many of these projects. You can build the most advanced digital infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have soft infrastructure, you do not have a smart city.
Can you define soft infrastructure for me?
Hard infrastructure is the fiber optic cables and the concrete. Soft infrastructure is the people. It's the local culture, the education levels, the technical literacy of the population.
So it's the human capacity to actually use the tool.
Exactly. If you launch a brilliant citywide app for reporting potholes, but 40% of your population is illiterate or elderly and can't use a smartphone, your city isn't smart. It's just exclusive.
That's a really great point. It reminds me that the Taiwan model that was detailed in the notes, they added an extra letter to the standard acronym.
Yes. So in government procurement circles, we always talk about PPP, public-private partnerships.
The government and business working together to build something.
Right. But Taiwan promotes the PPP model.
Public-private people partnership.
It sounds like a catchy marketing slogan, but it fundamentally changes the architecture of these projects. Instead of the government treating citizens like passive users or subjects to be managed, they treat them as active co-creators.
Partners.
Yeah.
How does that actually work in practice?
Look at the city of Tainan. They have initiatives where citizens are actually given air quality sensors to carry around or install on their balconies.
Oh, so the citizens are the ones collecting the data.
Yes. They collect it, they analyze it through open source platforms, and they work directly with the government to identify micropollution hotspots.
So instead of the city watching me from above, I'm actually watching the city with my neighbors.
It democratizes the data completely. It shifts the dynamic from surveillance to participation, and that requires a strong knowledge economy. Smart cities have to invest heavily in libraries, digital literacy programs, and the arts.
Because you need a smart population to run a smart city. But we have to address the elephant in the server room here. Or maybe the glitch in the matrix.
Yeah.
Not everyone is happy about this transition. There's a massive backlash brewing against the whole concept.
Oh, absolutely. And for very valid reasons. The skepticism is growing fast.
Let's talk about surveillance capitalism.
This is a term popularized by the scholar Shoshana Zuboff. It's a critical concept. It's the idea that human experience is basically being claimed as free, raw material for translation into behavioral data.
Can you translate that into English for me?
Basically, if the product is free, you are the product. We accept this on social media, right? We know Facebook tracks our clicks to sell targeted ads.
Sure, we all know that bargain.
But in a smart city, that business model moves from your phone screen to your physical street.
So I walk down the sidewalk, and the city infrastructure tracks my gait, my location, my shopping habits, and then turns around and sells that to an advertiser.
Or uses it to artificially raise land values. The fear is that the city isn't being optimized for the residents' happiness or well-being. It's being optimized for corporate data extraction.
Are we building cities for people, or are we building cities as massive data farms for tech vendors?
That is the exact question critics are asking.
That is a very dystopian thought, and it gets even darker when you look at how that data is used by the state. Predictive policing.
This is one of the most contentious applications of AI in urban spaces.
The idea is simple, right? You feed historical crime data into an algorithm and let it predict where crime will happen next.
Yes. And ideally, you send patrol cars there before the crime even happens. Very Minority Report.
But algorithms are only as good as the data you feed them.
Precisely. Garbage in, garbage out. If your historical data is heavily biased, for example, if the police have historically over-policed minority neighborhoods for minor offenses, the data will show, quote-unquote, more crime in those specific areas.
Because that's where they were looking.
Right. The AI doesn't know the historical context. It just sees raw numbers. So it tells the police commander to patrol those specific neighborhoods even more heavily today.
Which inevitably leads to more arrests in those neighborhoods.
Which creates more data confirming that's where the crime is. It becomes a closed feedback loop, a mathematical justification for racial profiling hidden behind the veneer of objective technology.
So the smart city just automates and amplifies the prejudices of the past.
It absolutely can if we aren't incredibly careful with how these algorithms are audited.
And then there is the digital divide. We touched on this with the soft infrastructure point. But seriously, if the city runs on an app, what happens to my grandmother?
Or the homeless population. Or the working poor who can't afford a reliable data plan. If accessing basic government services, like applying for public housing or paying a parking fine, requires high-tech access, you effectively create a caste system.
The connected class and the disconnected class.
Yes. You become a second-class citizen in your own hometown just because you don't have the right smartphone.
This isn't just theoretical either. There's a very specific story in the source notes about the Salisbury controversy.
Ah, yes, the Salisbury case in 2023. in South Australia. This is a classic textbook example of how not to roll out smart infrastructure.
Oh, happened.
The local government in Salisbury proposed a fairly standard smart city rollout. Smart streetlights, CCTV environmental sensors, the usual works.
And I assume the city council thought the residents would be thrilled to have better lighting and safer parks.
They almost certainly did. Instead, the proposal exploded. There was a massive, intense community backlash.
Why?
Conspiracy theories started spreading like wildfire that this was the beginning of a Chinese-style social credit system, or that it was a quote-unquote 15-minute city lockdown grid designed to restrict movement.
Why was the reaction so hostile to just streetlights and sensors?
Because there was absolutely no trust. The government came in top-down. They basically said, we're installing this, it's for your own good. They didn't use the PP model.
They didn't partner with the people.
Right. When people don't understand the underlying technology and they already don't trust the government's motives, they will inevitably view smart features as weapons of control.
It really shows that you can't just engineer a city like it's a motherboard. You have to govern it.
Trust is the actual currency of the smart city. If you spend it all or lose it, the whole system fails no matter how good the tech is.
There's one more major risk I want to highlight from the deep dive materials. We've talked about hacking, which is obvious if everything is online, but the lock-in effect.
Vendor lock-in. This is a huge economic trap for municipalities.
Explain how that works.
Imagine a mid-sized city signs a massive 10-year contract with a giant tech conglomerate, let's just call them megacorp, to run their traffic lights, their water sensors, and their emergency dispatch systems.
Okay, they hire megacorp.
They install megacorp's proprietary sensors, proprietary software, and proprietary servers.
Right.
5 years later, the city wants to change how a system works. Or maybe megacorp suddenly jacks up the maintenance prices by 40%. The city decides they want to switch to a different, cheaper software provider.
But they can't.
Exactly. Nothing else on the market is compatible with megacorp's physical sensors.
Because the code is closed.
Right. To switch providers, the city would literally have to dig up every single street and replace every physical sensor in the asphalt. It's prohibitively expensive.
So the city's completely trapped.
They effectively lose their digital sovereignty to a private corporation. The corporation dictates the terms of the city's infrastructure.
That is terrifying. It's like being trapped in the Apple ecosystem, but instead of your photos, it's your entire municipal water supply.
And finally, there is the deep environmental irony of all this. We say these cities are green. We love the solar compactors in Amsterdam. But the infrastructure itself has a massive physical cost.
Like the Jevons paradox.
In a way, yes. Think about the brain we talked about. The massive data centers required to process all this real-time AI data consume colossal amounts of electricity and millions of gallons of water just for cooling the servers.
Right, the cloud is actually a physical building somewhere burning energy.
And the millions of physical sensors require rare earth minerals, lithium, cobalt, copper. Mining those materials is devastating to the environment.
So there is a real risk that the environmental footprint of building the smart city actually outweighs the energy savings from having smart street lights dimming at night.
It is a very precarious balancing act. Every single efficiency gained has a hidden physical cost somewhere else on the globe.
So bringing this all together, we have the nerves, the brain, the senses, we have the incredible flow of traffic, but we have algorithmic biases and vendor lock-in and surveillance capitalism. What is the final verdict from the sources? Where is all of this actually going?
The overarching consensus is that the technology itself is inevitable. We aren't going to suddenly stop putting microchips in things. Moore's Law doesn't care about our privacy concerns. But the application of that technology, that is entirely a political choice.
So we are standing at a fork in the road right now.
We are. And one path leads straight to the technocratic city.
What does that look like?
A city entirely run by algorithms. It is hyper-efficient. It is clean. It is cold. It's a place where the human citizen is reduced to just another data point to be managed and optimized by the system. A city that flows perfectly, but where no one is truly free from observation.
And the other path?
The human-centric city. This is a city where the technology is almost completely invisible. It operates quietly in the background, not to control us, but to support human flourishing.
Like clearing the traffic so we actually have more time to spend with our families at home.
Exactly. It monitors the air quality so our kids are healthier. It empowers the citizen to participate rather than just harvesting their data for profit.
It's the difference between a city that just watches you and a city that actually sees you.
That is a profound way to put it, yes.
So here's my challenge for you listening to this right now. Next time you are waiting at a busy intersection on your commute, just look up. Don't just look at the red light. Look for the camera lens mounted next to it. Look for the little gray box bolted to the street lamp.
Look for the subtle sensor on the side of the trash can.
And ask yourself a simple question. Is this serving me? Is it helping me get home safer and faster? Or is it just another data point in a server farm somewhere calculating my value?
It is arguably the most important question you can ask about your modern environment.
Keep looking for those invisible threads, everyone. The city is getting smarter every single day. Make sure you are too. We will see you in the next deep dive.
You know, when we think about terraforming a planet, like making it perfectly suitable for modern life, we usually imagine a fleet of futuristic spaceships deploying these high-tech atmospheric processors.
Right. It's a very neat sort of science fiction solution to what is actually an incredibly messy, violent chemical problem.
Yeah, it's always clinical and engineered in the movies, but if you want to see how a planet actually gets terraformed, I mean, you don't need spaceships, you just need to look at the power grid.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the electricity running your life right now is very likely drawing power from this chaotic biological factory that Earth built over, 300 million years ago?
Give or take, yeah.
So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of research in front of us today, and our mission is to explore a time of just extreme biological weirdness.
It really is.
We are looking at giant, scaly trees, absolute monster-sized bugs, and the dramatic climate shifts that quite literally fueled the modern world.
I'd say it is arguably the most transformative period in Earth's history. We are talking about an era that fundamentally rewrote the rules of biology and atmospheric chemistry all at the exact same time.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into the Carboniferous period. This spans from roughly 358.9 to 298.9 million years ago. And right off the bat, that name, Carboniferous, what does that actually tell us about what the planet was doing?
Well, the name kind of gives away the ending, in a sense. Carboniferous literally translates from Latin as coal-bearing.
Coal-bearing.
Yeah, and it is incredibly literal. The vast majority of the Earth's extractable coal deposits were laid down during this specific 60 million year window.
Wow.
And the period is really defined by two monumental innovations. First, you have the establishment of the first truly massive terrestrial forest. And second, the evolutionary explosion of four-limbed vertebrates, our distant ancestors, finally moving inland.
But before we talk about what was living on the land, we have to talk about the land itself, right? Because the continents weren't just sitting there in the shapes we know today. They were actively crashing together.
Oh, yeah. It was a violently active geological era. You essentially had two massive land masses slowly colliding. Laurussia in the north and Gondwana in the south.
Gondwana.
Right. This is the very beginning of the assembly of the supercontinent Pangaea. And, you know, when continents collide, billions of tons of crust have nowhere to go but up.
Right, they just crumple.
Exactly. This slow-motion crash pushed up the central Pangaean Mountains. To picture the scale here, imagine a mountain range comparable to the Himalayas today, but stretching over 10,000 kilometers.
10,000.
Yeah, running all the way from what is now the Gulf of Mexico straight across to modern-day Europe and Turkey.
That is just a staggering physical barrier. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your head around. And because of where these continents were positioned right across the humid equator, it created this bizarre environment right at the foot of these new mountains, right?
Yes, exactly. The sheer weight of those mountains pushed down on the continental crust next to them, creating what geologists call foreland basins.
Foreland basins, okay.
These massive low-lying depressions that just filled with fresh water. And because they were sitting right on the equator, they became these endless, deeply humid peat mires and swamps.
And looking at our source notes here, those swamps were dominated by plants that would look entirely alien to us today. The biggest ones were these giant lycophytes, especially a tree called lepidodendron.
Lepidodendron.
But reading through the research, it says they didn't have wood like modern trees do. So how does a 10-story tree, like 30 meters high, even stand up without solid wood on the inside?
That is the truly bizarre part. We call them trees, but they were actually giant scale trees, distantly related to modern club mosses. A modern tree relies on its inner core, the xylem, for structural support.
Right, the wood holds it up.
Exactly. Lepidodendron was the complete opposite. It basically grew from its cortex, meaning its bark.
It's bark.
Yeah, the thick, scaly bark on the outside provided almost all the structural stability, while the inside was mostly just soft, pithy tissue.
So they were basically giant, rigid tubes of bark balancing in the mud?
Exactly that. And because they lacked deep, anchoring taproots, they relied instead on these shallow, sprawling root systems called stigmaria.
Oh.
So they were incredibly fragile. They would grow phenomenally fast in these waterlogged swamps, reach a massive height, and then a strong wind, or just a shift in the mud, would knock them over. They were constantly falling down.
Constant tree falls. So we have millions of massive 10-story tubes of bark falling down into these swamps. But they aren't rotting. They're just piling up layer after layer, creating the coal we use today.
Right.
Why weren't they rotting? What was missing from this ecosystem? Because I've seen this term delayed fungal evolution thrown around in the research.
Oh, wait, is the idea literally that these 30-meter trees were piling up like uncollected trash for millions of years just because fungi hadn't, learned how to eat wood yet? Well, it's one of the most fiercely debated hypotheses in paleobotany right now. The delayed fungal evolution theory suggests almost exactly that.
That's crazy.
Yeah, the structural compound that makes bark and wood so tough is a complex polymer called lignin. And the theory argues that plants invented lignin to grow tall, but there was this massive evolutionary lag.
Oh, I see.
It took millions of years for specific organisms, specifically basidiomycete fungi, which are the ancestors of many modern mushrooms, to evolve the specialized enzymes capable of breaking that lignin down.
So it really was just a planetary scale garbage strike. The trees fall, nothing has the biological tools to digest them, so they just sit there and eventually get buried.
That is the classic view.
Mm-hmm.
And genetic analysis of modern fungi actually provides some support for this, suggesting those specific lignin-degrading enzymes didn't fully evolve until the Permian period, which came after the Carboniferous.
Okay, so case closed, right?
Well, no. It is actually a bit more complex than just a garbage strike.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, some geologists point out a massive flaw in that theory. We still had massive coal deposits form in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, tens of millions of years after fungi had definitely figured out how to eat wood.
Oh, that's a great point. If the fungi learned to eat lignin, why did the Earth keep making coal?
Right, so the competing theory argues that it wasn't a biological failure at all. It was just geological perfection.
Geological perfection.
Yeah, you had continents sitting right on the equator, driving year-round, explosive plant growth. But crucially, you had that tectonic subsidence we mentioned earlier. The ground in those foreland basins next to the mountains was slowly sinking.
Oh, sinking under the weight.
Exactly. It was sinking at the exact same rate that the dead trees were piling up.
Oh, so it's a conveyor belt.
A perfectly balanced conveyor belt.
Mm-hmm.
The trees fall into the stagnant swamp water, and before any fungi or bacteria can even attempt to break them down, they are buried in anoxic, meaning oxygen-starved mud.
And without oxygen, they can't rot.
Exactly. Without oxygen, decomposition essentially halts. Whether the fungi had the right enzymes or not didn't really matter because the trees were drowning in mud way too fast to rot.
I love that. It's this perfect storm of mountain buildings, sinking crust, and hyperactive forests. But if we pull back, burying all that unrotted plant matter did a lot more than just give us fossil fuels, right? It hacked the entire planet's atmosphere.
It really did.
Because plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. If you bury the plant, what happens to the oxygen that was supposed to recombine with that carbon when the tree rotted?
The loop is broken, the carbon goes into the earth, and that free oxygen just stays in the atmosphere.
Wow.
And over millions of years, it builds up to astonishing levels. Well, estimates vary slightly depending on the geochemical modeling you look at. The general consensus is that atmospheric oxygen climbed from roughly 15% at the start of the period up to a staggering 25 to 30%.
30%.
Yeah. For context, today's atmosphere is only about 21% oxygen.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you alter the baseline chemistry of the air that drastically, biology just goes wild. We always hear about giant bugs in this era. How exactly does more oxygen equal giant bugs? I mean, it's not like they just inhale more and magically inflate, right?
No. It comes down to the physical mechanics of how they actually breathe.
Yeah.
Insects and other arthropods don't have active bellows-like lungs like vertebrates do.
Okay.
They breathe through a network of tiny internal tubes called tracheae. These tubes rely heavily on the passive diffusion of oxygen from the outside air into their tissues.
Massive diffusion.
Right. So in a 21% oxygen atmosphere, there's a strict physical limit on how big a bug can get before the oxygen simply cannot diffuse deeply enough into its body to keep its cells alive.
So it's a bottleneck. The atmosphere literally suffocates them if they grow too large.
Exactly.
But if the oxygen jumps to 30%, it's like turning the whole environment into a pressurized hyperbaric chamber. So that passive diffusion is suddenly supercharged.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. That bottleneck is entirely removed, and the result is legendary gigantism. So it's like Mother Nature cranked the oxygen dial to 11, turning everyday garden pests into the cast of a monster movie.
Oh, totally.
You get creatures like Arthropleura. It is officially the largest known terrestrial invertebrate of all time.
I was looking at the reconstructed size of this thing in the source files. It's a millipede-like creature that grew to 8.5 feet long.
Huge.
Over 2.5 meters, just scuttling through the ferns. I mean, 8.5 feet.
Yeah, and the gigantism was literally everywhere. You look up and you have the griffin flies. The most famous is Meganura, which looked almost exactly like a modern dragonfly, but it had a wingspan of 30 inches.
30 inches. That is the size of a hawk.
It is. And on the forest floor, you had Pulmonoscorpius, an apex predator scorpion over 2 feet long.
I am just picturing a hawk-sized dragonfly swooping down through a misty swamp. It feels completely alien. But it wasn't just the land that got weird. The ocean had its own bizarre experiments going on, too. What was happening beneath the waves?
Well, the oceans were incredibly dynamic because of what happened right before the Carboniferous began. The end of the preceding Devonian period saw a mass extinction event that completely wiped out the dominant, heavily armored fish of the time, known as the placoderms.
So all the apex predators suddenly vanish?
Exactly. It left a massive ecological vacuum. And, nature abhors a vacuum. Without the placoderms dominating the food chain, cartilaginous fish, basically sharks and their relatives, underwent a massive evolutionary radiation. They expanded into all these newly opened niches.
And reading about some of these sharks, it sounds like evolution was just throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. There's Stephacanthus. The notes call it the brush fin shark.
Yes, Stephacanthus.
It had this flat, anvil-shaped dorsal fin with a patch of spiky denticles on top. Why on earth would a shark need a spiky anvil on its back?
It is incredibly strange, isn't it? The leading theory is that it was driven by sexual selection, possibly used in mating rituals or to intimidate rivals. Without the intense predatory pressure of the placoderms, these bizarre, highly specialized anatomical features had the breathing room to evolve and persist.
That makes sense. And then there's Adestus, which I can only describe as a nightmare.
Oh, yes.
It didn't have normal rows of teeth that shed like a modern great white. It had these terrifying, curved, buzzsaw-like tooth whorls right in the middle of its mouth.
Yes, the tooth whorls. As new teeth grew in, the old ones weren't shed. They were pushed outward, creating these massive projecting brackets of sharp teeth.
Just sticking out of its face.
Yeah. It completely changes how we think about how prehistoric predators captured and processed their prey. It was just an era of profound biological experimentation.
But this hyper-oxygenated, giant bug-filled swamp party couldn't last forever, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If pumping out oxygen was caused by burying millions of tons of carbon, what happens to a planet when you suck all the carbon out of the sky?
It freezes. You plunge the Earth into a deep, deep freeze. This is the late Paleozoic Ice Age. It was the most extensive and longest-lasting icehouse period of the entire Phanerozoic eon.
Wait, the Phanerozoic eon, just to ground us, what time frame are we actually talking about there?
The Phanerozoic is the current geological eon. It started about 538 million years ago with the Cambrian explosion of complex life, and it continues right up to today.
Okay.
So out of the last 500 million years of complex life on Earth, this Carboniferous deep freeze was the longest sustained ice age.
I'm trying to piece this together. We always hear today about CO2 warming the planet by trapping heat, right? But here, it's the exact opposite. Did Earth basically sequester its own carbon so efficiently that it forced itself into an ice age? Like, could the forests alone really suck up enough carbon to freeze an entire planet? That seems like a massive leap.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it wasn't just the forests. You were looking at the ultimate demonstration of Earth's climate feedback loops. The swamp forests were absolutely pulling massive amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere and burying it, yes.
You're right.
But remember those 10,000-kilometer-long Central Pangean Mountains we talked about?
Right, the Himalayan scale mountains pushing up at the equator.
As those brand new mountains were exposed to the tropical elements, they underwent intense chemical weathering. Rainwater is naturally slightly acidic because it absorbs CO2 from the air.
Okay.
When that rain hits newly exposed silicate rocks in a mountain range, a chemical reaction occurs that literally binds the atmospheric carbon to the minerals. Those minerals then wash into the sea and lock the carbon away in layers of limestone and carbonate sediments on the ocean floor.
Oh, wow. So the plants are burying carbon in the swamps, and the mountains are chemically eating carbon out of the rain. They teamed up.
They absolutely teamed up, and the combined result was a catastrophic drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide. During the peak of this glacial period, CO2 levels plummeted to as low as 175 parts per million.
175.
Yeah, for context, pre-industrial levels in our modern era were around 280, and today we're well over 420.
So at 175 parts per million, the greenhouse blanket is practically gone. The heat just escapes into space.
Exactly. Global average temperatures plummeted. Massive, continent-spanning glaciers expanded across the entire south polar region of Gondwana.
And a glacier isn't just a static block of ice, right? It breathes. It waxes and wanes. The notes mention these were driven by Milankovitch cycles.
Yes, Milankovitch cycles.
Which are these subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit that happen over 100,000-year intervals. When the Earth's orbit brings it slightly closer to the sun, the ice melts. When it shifts away, the ice freezes. And every time that happens, global sea levels radically change.
It creates a planetary sea level seesaw. When the South Pole froze, the oceans shrank. When it melted, the oceans rapidly flooded the continents.
How do we actually see this in the rock record today? The source material mentions cyclothams, but what does a sea level seesaw actually look like when you stare at a cliff face?
It looks like a repeating barcode of ancient climate change. Walk through it chronologically with me.
Okay, right.
Imagine standing on a shallow continental shelf at the equator. The ice sheets at the South Pole grow, so sea levels fall worldwide. The land you are standing on is suddenly exposed. Rivers carve deep valleys into the mud.
Okay, so we have dry land and river valleys. That's the base layer.
Then the Milankovitch cycle shifts. The climate warms slightly, polar ice melts, and the sea level rapidly rises. The water backs up into those river valleys, turning them into massive stagnant swamps. Our peat mires?
Right.
Those swamps lay down a thick layer of plant matter, which becomes coal.
So that's layer 2, valley dirt, then coal.
As the sea continues to rise relentlessly, the swamp is drowned completely. It's replaced by a shallow, warm marine environment, which lays down a layer of calcium carbonate or limestone.
Okay, dirt, coal, limestone.
Finally, at maximum sea depth, the water becomes deep, still, and a noxic, settling fine silt that becomes dark marine shale.
Wow.
Then the cycle shifts again. The ice freezes, the sea falls, the shale is exposed to erosion, a swamp forms, the sea rises, limestone shale. Over and over and over again.
So you get these perfectly stacked, repeating layers, non-marine dirt, coal, limestone shale, dirt, coal, limestone shale. That is an incredible visual. But this extreme environmental whiplash, I mean, the seesawing sea levels and the plummeting global temperatures, that has to take a massive toll on biology.
Oh, absolutely.
The environment that birthed these giant scale trees is literally vanishing beneath them. What happens to a forest that suddenly finds itself in a freezing, rapidly changing world?
It collapses. This event is actually known as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. The global climate snapped. It went from being hot and universally humid across the entire equatorial belt to being cool and highly arid.
The continuous, globe-spanning swamp forests simply couldn't survive without that constant moisture.
They couldn't. They shrank and fragmented into isolated islands of wetlands surrounded by harsh, dry, seasonal environments. The giant 30-meter lepidodendron scale trees that relied on waterlogged mud essentially died off.
They just couldn't hack it.
No, they were replaced by much less diverse, hardier flora like tree ferns, which could tolerate drier soils.
And if you're an animal that evolved to perfectly dominate a humid, waterlogged swamp, suddenly your entire universe is evaporating. What happens to the amphibians? Because at this point, they were the undisputed kings of the land, right? You had these massive crocodile-sized amphibians ruling the swamps.
They were the apex predators, for sure. But amphibians have a fatal physiological flaw when it comes to dry land. Their skin is highly permeable, meaning they lose internal moisture very quickly in dry air.
Right.
And crucially, their eggs are soft and jelly-like. They must lay their eggs in water, or the eggs simply desiccate and die.
So without water, an amphibian fundamentally cannot reproduce.
Exactly. So as the swamps fragmented and the air dried out, amphibian biodiversity suffered catastrophic, irrecoverable losses. They were trapped on shrinking islands of moisture, completely unable to cross the arid expanses between them.
It's like amphibians were stuck using landlines tied to the water while reptiles just invented the smartphone. The hard-shelled egg made them completely mobile and untethered from the swamps.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because while the amphibians were dying out, another group of animals figured out a way to cut the cord. I saw two specific groups mentioned in our source material, sauropsids and synapsids. What's the difference between them and how did they survive this dying, drying world?
Well, both of those groups fall under a larger umbrella called the amniotes. To clarify the term, sauropsids are the evolutionary lineage that includes all modern reptiles and birds.
Okay, reptiles and birds.
Synapsids are a distinct, separate lineage that eventually gave rise to mammals, meaning us.
Oh, wow, okay.
The reason both of these groups survived while the amphibians perished comes down to one of the greatest physiological hacks in evolutionary history.
The amniotic egg.
Exactly. The hard-shelled or leathery amniotic egg.
It's basically a self-contained portable pond. It has its own water supply and nutrient yolk sealed inside a protective membrane.
Precisely. And combined with that, these early amniotes developed heavily keratinized scales on their skin.
Keratinized scales.
Right. Keratin is the same protein that makes up your hair and fingernails. On a reptile, it acts like a biological waterproof seal, locking their internal moisture inside their bodies so it doesn't evaporate into the dry air.
So they were completely untethered from the swamps. They had mobile eggs and waterproof skin.
The so what of this moment cannot be overstated. The collapse of the rainforests was a devastating tragedy for the amphibians, but it provided the exact evolutionary pressure and the exact empty ecological real estate needed to launch the amniotes.
Because they could handle the dry land.
Right, because they had the physiological tools to survive in arid, seasonal environments. They quickly expanded out of the dying swamps and conquered all these newly opened, dry niches.
The death of the swamps cleared the stage for the next massive act of life on Earth.
Those early amniotes, the creatures that survived the brutal Carboniferous rainforest collapse, are the direct, unbroken ancestors of every reptile, every bird, and every single mammal on Earth today.
Including you and me.
Including us. If the climate hadn't changed, if the forests hadn't buried all that carbon and frozen the planet, amphibians might still rule the world.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. We've traced an unbelievable chain reaction today. We went from continental plates crashing together to form a 10,000-kilometer mountain range, which created massive foreland basins.
Right.
Those basins filled with alien forests of fragile bark-growing trees. We explored how tectonic subsidence buried those trees, pumping so much oxygen into the air that millipedes grew to the size of alligators.
Huge millipedes.
And we saw how that exact same process, combined with the weathering of those new mountains, pulled so much carbon out of the sky that the Earth froze itself, triggering a sea level seesaw, destroying the rainforests and forcing our scaly ancestors to invent the hard-shelled egg just to survive.
It is a profound story of deep interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Biology actively changing the climate, and then the climate violently reshaping biology.
Yeah.
You simply cannot separate the geology of the Earth from the life that walks on it.
So what does this all mean? We started by talking about the energy grid. Over the course of the Carboniferous, the Earth spent 60 million years slowly pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, locking that solar energy underground, and fundamentally altering the trajectory of evolution to favor our ancestors.
Exactly.
Today, we are digging up those 60 million years of stored carbon and pumping it right back into the atmosphere in the span of just a couple of centuries.
And that's the kicker. The last time the atmosphere's chemistry shifted this dramatically, it wiped out the dominant life forms and handed the entire planet over to a completely new mutant branch of survivors.
Wow.
The question isn't whether life will survive our current carbon experiment. The question is, who or what is currently waiting in the wings for our climate to snap?
Something for you to think about next time you flip a light switch.